Thank you. Speaking of epistemological Catholicity, I want to pick up the thread of John Henry Newman again for some of my observations about the 800th anniversary of the Order of Preachers and for the stewardship of knowledge. In several sermons and essays in the 15 years after his conversion, 1845, the theme of the Dominican stewardship of knowledge became a rather prominent, even if unfinished, theme in John Henry Newman's work. In an 1851 sermon, for example, quote, "It was the magnificent aim of the children of St. Dominic to form the whole matter of human knowledge into one harmonious system, to secure the alliance between religion and philosophy, and to train men to use the gifts of nature in the sunlight of divine grace and revealed truth," unquote. Just after his conversion, Newman went to Rome, went to Italy for 2 years. He was ordained a priest, but as he discussed it in his essays and sermons, there were 2 questions he had to answer for himself. The first was the most immediate: how should he live his life? Some people said he should be a Benedictine. He was too much a university man to go in that direction, but others said, for sure, a Dominican, and still others said, a Jesuit. Well, he returned 2 years later from England as an Oratorian, which he regarded as a kind of synthesis of those 3. Even though he had decided his own religious life, he reflected deeply over 2 decades about what makes these religious orders different from one another, what is the distinctive charism and mission of each, and most of all, how do these fundamental religious orders give us models for apprehending the truths of religion. The second question he had to answer is, what kind of knowledge is religion? Where does doctrine stand in the modern panoply of sciences and arts? A question he really only answers at the very end in Grammar of Assent, 1870. His first attempt to deal with both of these questions was a schema. In fact, the schema, which he repeated 2 or 3 times, were like finger exercise going toward the Grammar of Assent. Quote, "Benedict, Dominic, Ignatius. These are the 3 venerable patriarchs of the Church, her nursing fathers." Quote, "Now St. Benedict has had the training of the ancient intellect, Dominic of the medieval intellect, and Ignatius of the modern intellect," unquote. To continue, "St. Benedict, to this great saint, let me assign for his discriminating badge the element of poetry, to St. Dominic the scientific element, and to St. Ignatius the practical." And he continues, "These characteristics, which belong respectively to the schools of the 3 great nursing teachers, grow out of the circumstances under which they respectively entered upon their work. Benedict, entrusted with his mission almost as a boy, infused into it the romance and simplicity of boyhood. Dominic, a man of 45, a graduate in theology, a priest and a canon, brought with him into religion that maturity and completeness of learning which he had acquired in the schools. Ignatius, a man of the world, even before his conversion, transmitted as a legacy to his disciples that knowledge of mankind which cannot be learned in cloisters. And thus, the 3 several orders were, so to speak, the births of poetry, science, and practical sense. Perhaps Velma would have an opinion on this, but I think this triadic scheme comes from Shakespeare's As You Like It, although I've never been able to exactly track the thing down. She probably knows. You know, in As You Like It, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women are players, and they have their exits and entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, his acts being 7 ages. Interesting sidebar. Newman spoke quite a bit about Dominic, but promised to produce a freestanding essay on the mission of Dominic. But he said he would never write one on Ignatius. And here's a very wry remark. I'm only going to quote part of the sentence. The very genius of his order is to prefer this most excellent prudence to every other gift, and to think very little of both poetry and science unless they happen to be useful, unquote. But as for Benedict, who taught poetically, Newman said, it demands as its primary condition that we should not put ourselves above the objects in which it resides, but at their feet. And we should feel them to be above and beyond us. We should look up to them. And that instead of fancying that we can comprehend them, we should take for granted that we are surrounded and comprehended by them. It implies that we understand them to be vast, immeasurable, impenetrable, inscrutable, mysterious, so that at best we are only forming conjectures about them, not conclusions, for the phenomena which they represent admit of many explanations. In any case, poetry addresses the imagination and affections, and it leads to admiration, enthusiasm, delight, devotion, and love. Now, by the poetical, Newman did not mean simply feelings or the art of metered verse, but rather a deeply resonant and maybe the original way of knowing, mode of knowing. It's the contact with the experience of the senses, with things and persons. Those of you who have read The Grammar of Assent, you'll notice the notion of real assent surfacing in his treatment of Benedict, which engenders always knowledge touched by emotion. And in the ancient world, the beginning of the poetical knowledge would have been twofold, even before we get to the liberal arts or the trivium. The gymnastic, where reason learns to control the body, the external senses, and music, where reason learns to master the internal senses, chiefly the emotions. So that poetical stewardship is not merely accumulating experiences like a tourist, much less is it cataloging or analyzing or systematizing information. It's variation of experience, repetition, variation. The whole is always coming into view through the particulars in new ways. And I think it's very, very apt. Benedict's rule, admonition in the rule, that vast storehouse of wisdom in the 150 Psalms that should be sung every week, they should be appropriated, he says, suaviter, sweetly, not analytically. Just keep on doing them over and over again, and when there's delight, you know you're getting somewhere with it. In any case, the poetical is the irreplaceable, persistent, dynamic ground of all unification of human knowledge. We begin with it in the nursery, and if Shakespeare is right and As You Like It, we end with it. Old men and like children. As for Dominic, Newman says, he had a breadth of view aiming at comprehension. Quote, he's speaking of the children of Dominic, the Dominicans. That single aim of subduing this various, multiform, and many-colored world to the unity of divine service. And speaking of the medieval schoolmen, Newman said, what whole was not analyzed, what complex idea was not elaborately traced out, and as it were, finely painted for the contemplation of the mind? Reason investigates, analyzes, numbers, weighs, measures, ascertains, locates the objects of its contemplation, and thus gains the scientific knowledge of them. And so what is science? Well, it's all those things leading up to philosophy. As Newman is understanding science. But it marks the age of a person or of a church or of a period of history in which we come to be responsible not merely for the accumulation of information or for professional accreditation. We come to understand ourselves as responsible for how we think. The intellect mastering not only its own body or its emotions, but its own acts. To distinguish different arts and sciences, to lay out paradigms of knowledge, which we do in the trivium, grammar, inference, definition, to weigh the kinds of evidence and certainty appropriate to various intellectual endeavors. It's this stewardship of knowledge that he attributes to the children of Dominic, and its object is not just this or that piece of knowledge, but the very structure of knowledge. That's what flows from beginning to understand one's own intellective acts. Whereas poetical knowledge cannot be preserved without delight. Scientific knowledge cannot be preserved or advanced without abstraction and attention to how we give assent to propositions that are general, and usually much less vivid than those pertaining to music, and seemingly much less urgent than those pertaining to the practical order. Now, Newman always insisted, when he would go through this finger exercise of the three patriarchs, three paradigms, that he's not intending to separate them, only to distinguish them. He always insisted that the church needs the cowl of the poet, the hood of the scholar, and the practical instruments of the mission. And, well, to quote him, the church did not lose Benedict by finding Dominic, and she still has both Benedict and Dominic at home, though she has become the mother of Ignatius. Imagination, science, prudence are all good, and she has them all. And he notes, and the Dominicans have them all in the best way, because their vocation involves both the contemplation, the science, and the communication. Now, to conclude, it does belong to human beings to ask, even as children, how does it all fit together? And the poetic, the scientific, and the practical, each one and all together, are ways of answering that question. But history is very clear, and Father Richard has only mentioned a bit of it, that these three can be at war with each other, and that the knowledge appropriate to one can overwhelm and derange or disturb the others. This was certainly Newman's own view of the problem of the medieval universities. A lot was at stake how they ended up being balanced. Now, I think what Newman meant by scientific knowledge, which is more than what we mean by science, has always been disparaged, and it's disparaged most by the educated. It always has been most disparaged by the educated. Science is always the weakest and most difficult to sustain of the three ways. Indeed, even our physical and mathematical sciences today, despite their dazzling sophistication, in most institutions depend immediately and entirely on the fragile thread of their utility. People would abandon them immediately if they didn't think they were useful. Yes, science always seems hollow and puffed up in comparison to the poetic and the practical, and especially for religious people, right? I'd rather feel compunction than to know it. Better to feel compunction and to work in the vineyard. That is the mission of Benedict and Ignatius, or the superior missions. And I would propose that in the 1960s, or thereabouts, we had a secular rendition of wanting to split the poetical and the practical away from the scientific. The children of that generation, reacting against the one-dimensional science as research and Sputnik, suspicious of the structures of education, which were suspected of being deeply matter of propaganda, very suspicious of the authority of the professoriate, decided what we need is experience, more experience. We want particulars, not generalities. Novelties, yes, please. They wanted music. I mean, the only lasting result of that culture was its music. It wanted the poetical. It would go for a bit of Asian religion in connection with that. And it wanted praxis. That is, not to know the world or to feel it, but to change it. Beginning with therapeutics as applied to the self. I would say that this is the secularization of the church as a field hospital. You live life for experience and a variation of experience poetically. And after that, it's all serious. It's politics. It's changing the world. And very few students today, as a result, either in matters of religious doctrine or the ordinary curricula of secular education, have a reliable understanding how all the things they're learning fit together. And in that void, the question, how does it all fit together, almost inevitably becomes ideology. How else to preserve even the appearance of a curriculum? And indeed, the ideological whole is a corruption of what Newman meant by poetry, science, and prudence. You cannot make or sustain ideology without poetry, quasi-poetry, quasi-science, and quasi-praxis. You need all three to have a good ideology, or a successful ideology. I've come to the end. I want to talk about Laudato Si, because I think this business of the cowl, the hood, and the practical instruments of the mission are right there in Laudato Si. Not in a Dominican, well-ordered way, maybe, but at the coda, just as a coda, I mentioned that Newman never promises to write one, the mission of St. Ignatius, among other reasons because he thought, why repeat this? It's what everyone knows by mid-19th century. But he did promise to write the mission of St. Dominic. Alas, the journal to which it was promised, the Atlantis, which he himself had founded at the Catholic University of Ireland, went out of print. I can't remember for how long, 10 or 15 years. Alas, we don't have that. We don't even have it in his notes. But I've given a 25-cent tour of it. Thank you.